Good morning, everybody, and welcome to the Royal Society of Edinburgh for the launch of our new report, A Little Less Conversation, taking its inspiration from Elvis Presley, which is probably the first time that's been achieved in Scottish politics. Just to say, we're going to be presenting to you for about an hour this morning or so. Various speakers will go through their take on the subject of our discussion this morning, which is the implementation gap, and then there'll be an opportunity for questions afterwards. Following that, there will be a light lunch served, and you're all very welcome to stay for as long as you wish and enjoy a conversation and a sandwich. Just for those of you who don't know, Our Scottish Future is an organisation that was set up about 4 years ago by Gordon Brown to try and make a kind of positive argument both for devolution in Scotland and for a kind of change and reform across the United Kingdom. We spent a lot of time on the UK bit of that, and we're now kind of looking more at how do we improve the way that devolution operates in Scotland. Hence the reason for this report today, to look at how do you actually transfer policy intent to policy delivery. So without further ado, I will hand over to the chair of Our Scottish Future, Jim Gallagher, who will introduce our speakers today. Thank you very much.
Good morning, everybody, and welcome, and thanks for the courage in turning out in such a dreary morning. I hope that you will find yourselves well rewarded. In fact, having read this report myself, I think you will find yourself well rewarded. I'm going to introduce my colleagues here, and then you will have the benefit of a presentation from Jamie Gollings. Jamie is the author of this report and has been lead researcher at Our Scottish Future. Tragically, he's got an even better job at the Social Market Foundation, so we'll be losing him, but we're very happy that he's with us here this morning, and we're very grateful, Jamie, for the work you've done on this particular report, and indeed on the other things you've done for us. On the far left, someone who's known, I think, to very many of you in the room is Philip Rycroft. Philip's a public servant with a very long and distinguished reputation. It wasn't his fault that they made him permanent secretary of the Brexit department, but he struggled manfully in that and has done splendid work in other areas as well, including in particular on the integration of the UK's territorial constitution at the centre of government in London, and he is now escaped, so many of us have, into academia, where he's at the Bennett Institute in Cambridge, and into making a living, as I understand people are expected to do nowadays. And on my immediate left is Lucy Hunter-Blackburn. Lucy too has a public service record in the civil service, and these days she's a wholly independent researcher, and you will have seen some of her work in newspapers, I'm quite sure, though we don't plan to talk about that particular subject today. So what we propose to do in handling this is, first, Jamie's going to speak for 10-15 minutes or so. We have happy slides, which I hope you can see. To the extent that my head is transparent, you'll be able to see them even more clearly. And then I'm going to invite Philip and Lucy to offer some reflections, and then we'll open up for general comments, discussion, questions, which we greatly look forward to. So, Jamie, this is the time that you need to wow the citizenry with your slides, which explain the report itself.
Great, thanks so much, Jim. So, the implementation gap. We weren't the first people to use this term. It's something that we've been seeing around. We've seen it from the Auditor General talking about it. We've seen Shelter Scotland talking about it in reference to homelessness, the Health Foundation in reference to health inequality, and even the First Minister himself talking about this challenge around delivery that the Scottish Government is seeing. So the question we were asking is this just something we see across the Scottish body politic? If so, why? So we had a look at some big political priorities that have been happening in Scotland in the last decade or so. So things like the promise, curriculum for excellence, closing attainment gap, net zero, health inequalities and housing. And we tried to say, some in those areas, the aims they laid out have not always been met. is there something happening here that's sort of common throughout these pieces? So, two big questions. Number one, what is causing these problems? Are there some common themes that go across these different pieces? Number two, is there something particularly Scottish about them? I mean, obviously governments all over the world, I mean, just look at HS2, people are failing to do things that governments say they're going to do, but is there something particularly Scottish about here? So, to tackle that, we spoke to over 25 different experts in the field, so current and former politicians, people in the civil service and in delivery of public services, pulled through reports, pulled through committee hearings, to try to tackle these questions. So, what were our findings? So there were four big themes that we saw across all these different pieces. So, first of these, too much politics. 3 general elections, 2 Scottish elections, 2 big epoch-defining referenda. All of this means, more press conferences, more manifestos, more promises being made, and less time thinking about the actual delivery of these things. And the really important one of those was on the Constitution. I mean, this has been a campaign that's been running, felt like for 10 years now, always just around the corner. And when you're in that kind of environment of sort of constantly campaigning and something always about to happen, this pretense that we're about to have a second referendum, you end up with, these constant sort of campaigning politics as well. So perhaps that's, it just means that when a politician is thinking about how to take the public with them, they're focusing on either side of the constitutional debate. So for the SNP and for the Conservatives in particular, that means that they can always rely on their kind of constitutional side of the argument, and all they need to do is make sure that they come out. And that actually acts to disincentivise, we found, taking some difficult decisions on things that might upset the base in the short term. Because if you're always on the cusp of having another referendum on such a big topic, if you see something controversial now, that might hit your polling, and it might hit the ultimate goal on the Constitution. So we found that both, on all sides of the constitutional divide, that kind of the sort of the damage of too much politics. Secondly, too much government. This chart here, you won't be able to see the numbers on it, but it basically presents the number of sort of ministers and people in the Scottish Government over time. So you can sort of see that Alex Salmond came in, he sort of had a government of about 18 ministers and cabinet secretaries, and now we have 30 under Hamza Yousaf. And each of those ministers, they want to get in the press, they want to make sure they've got exciting things to announce, they've got things to put in the programme for government. And that means, there's only so many civil servants in the Scottish Government. So all these civil servants are split, between more and more ministers. More and more of these civil servants are worrying about having something interesting for their minister to say, or what's just been said about them on Twitter or whatever it might be. And this means there's fewer people there to actually deliver things, and fewer politicians in Parliament there on the government side, or on the SNP and the Greens in this case, able to sort of challenge some of their colleagues. So more people in government, fewer people to scrutinise them. We also found, it's something we heard across a lot of these things, a kind of addiction to sort of consultitis, sort of strategy document-itis. And I was a former strategy consultant, so there's nothing wrong with strategies, I'm going to say that. But, there's been over 500 released in the last decade. That's like 1 a week, which is quite a lot of strategies. Many of those covering the exact same ground as previous ones. So a new minister comes in, they say, I'm going to put my stamp on this. So I know what's changed in 18 months, and I've got a really slightly different idea on this policy spin. So you've got these civil servants, rather than trying to deliver the previous person's work, you've got them trying to come up with a new strategy for the new minister. And consultations as well, same story, about 500 in the last decade, 1 a week. So sometimes it's easier to, it's consultation, it's great, get the community behind you, behind all these priorities, but if you're spending so much time talking to people and listening to people, there's not actually enough time spent doing things. And so this consultitis is something that we've also found and kept coming up. Another piece is on the kind of the arms length bodies, the quangos, all those kinds of things. And many of them doing great work, but in a few of the cases, particularly Curriculum for Excellence comes to mind, you have them with slightly unclear, slightly overlapping briefs, and that just means that if no one's really accountable for these things, because lots of things seem to be accountable for it, then no one's actually going to be in charge and own up if things go wrong. So, perhaps there are too many of these things, or there's slightly overlapping priorities currently. So, too much government. One here basically focusing on the relationship between the Scottish Government and the UK Government, big theme that comes across a lot of our work in our Scottish Future. And it's something that was pointed out in that Health Foundation report we cited at the top, but also on the Committee for Climate Change as well, basically saying, these are priorities of health inequality, net zero, all things which the UK Government and the Scottish Government to a least extent, we want to address. So why aren't they working together properly on these things? And they're sort of making a play of the kind of conflict that they can bring out in those things, and there's political benefits to that. But actually, we want these things to happen, so let's work together to make it happen. So I think a bit more cooperation and a bit less conflict would help in many of these cases. Lastly, centralising cautious culture. So we're not the first people to say that the Scottish Government has been fairly centralising over the last few years. And so you can pull this out from a quote from the Auditor General, but it just leaves a lot of local government feeling quite disempowered and kind of beholden to the whims of the centre. Almost worried about the angry phone call from Holyrood if they do something that's a bit innovative or a bit risque, and that flows down into kind of a feeling of some hopelessness in the front line and in the sort of local government, where they're just sort of kowtowing to the will of the centre, and so you end up with this kind of decentralisation drives this kind of cautious culture or kind of conservative culture out in the front lines. This sort of presidentialisation as well is something that just sort of even strengthens that further. So those are our 4 big themes, but it's important to say that it's not all bad. There's been some great achievements, the devolved government, so whether it's on the Queensbury Crossing, National Manufacturing Institute, the Scottish Patient Safety Programme, many more great examples of change that has been delivered by this government. But we have to emphasise that it's a real problem, this implementation gap, and it should be a huge political priority, because whatever other priorities you can come up with, if you can't actually do anything about them, then nothing is going to change. So sure, the ability to do something to achieve things should be as important as what it is you're actually trying to do, and there should be a cross-party consensus on that, we feel. So when it came to thinking about what we should actually do about this, what are the solutions out there, the biggest one is frankly just one of political culture and leadership. A leader asking their ministers what that they said they were going to do last year, have they actually done, rather than what are they going to put into the new manifesto, or a government that is interested in telling the public about what it did last year and what it's achieved and what it's actually delivered, rather than what we're going to do for you in the future. So this kind of, and that kind of change of leadership can then flow down through the rest of the system. But a change of leadership, a change of political culture is asking for a lot. It's a big change. So we have some more structural solutions as well. So in terms of government reform, we're proposing. We showed you that graph. I mean, I don't know if we can necessarily say that 30 people in the front bench is more effective than 18 people in the front bench. I'm not sure if we'd say that. So suggesting a cap on ministers. So it basically forces the government to be more focused, to choose fewer priorities, but just to do them more effectively and stop spreading the civil service so thinly. Also has a benefit from some savings, which we'll come to a bit later. We touched on sort of the issue with quangos and some of the overlapping responsibilities and those things, so just questioning whether which of them are being effective, which are not being effective. Is there a way to sort of delineate their responsibilities more clearly, so that rather than having 3 agencies responsible for education or whatever it might be, that it's really clear who's in charge of what. That kind of delivery culture, civil servants, many of whom have delivered great things, but perhaps we can incorporate a bit more external expertise in there as well. So people from the private sector or from the front line of public services, people not just with experience in developing policy, but also in actually operationalising some of these things. A duty to cooperate. So we touched on the relationship between the UK government and Westminster and Holyrood, but also across the local government as well. A duty to cooperate in these things might be a slightly formalistic way of putting it, but by putting that in there, it can then flow through to a more cultural one. And then lastly, a couple of new institutions we've suggested. So the First Ministerial Delivery Unit, sort of slightly inspired by Barbara's one, to help help the centre track its progress on the things it says are the most important to it, and then a more powerful Scottish financial ministry, so giving the Treasury more powers to scrutinise spending lines and to check that when a minister is making a pledge on we're going to spend 100 million on this thing, actually half of it's just kind of earmarked from slightly other pots, and make big promises can sound really great, but if you say you're going to do 100 million pounds worth of stuff, and you only got £50 million worth of money, then funnily enough, you only end up actually achieving £50 million worth of stuff. So there's no wonder when you're kind of not really associating money with some of these priorities that they don't actually happen. So a few things there, but those last ones, you could see as slightly risking some centralisation. But so we want to build in some scrutiny into the system as well. So this is where furthering democracy is important, to creating some external bodies to challenge the government on its delivery and its priorities. So, as in Wales, a Future Generations Commissioner, accountable to the Parliament rather than to the government, to look at those long-term goals, whether it's on climate change or the attainment gap or whatever it might be, and to say, you said you're going to do these things, are these things actually happening? Here are some ideas that are being seen elsewhere, and challenging the government where it's making short-term decisions. Rewiring Scotland, so this is a teaser for a forthcoming Our Scottish Future report, so stay tuned for that. This is all about how we can rejig sort of within Scotland how local government works with agencies and communities to empower the front line, and basically try and eradicate that sense of despondency that we felt in our interviews and in the rest of our work. The last two of these are about Scottish Parliament committees. So there were some reforms in the Westminster Select Committees a decade or so ago that have helped to make them a sort of stronger bastion for independent thought. And so we suggest electing the membership of those committees rather than having them appointed by the leadership of the parties, so being another kind of bit of patronage for the leadership. And getting some more independent voices in there, but also incentivising people, some of the serious independent-minded backbenchers to take these roles by offering some money to the conveners of those committees and using some of the money that we save from the cap on the ministers. So those are the suggestions we've got for now. We'll leave you on this slide, which is basically a bit of a cultural checklist for a First Minister or anyone else who's interested in trying to address some of those four thematic problems that we saw. I'm not going to go through them now, but you can see them there. And if the First Minister wants to really change these things and turn Scotland into a place that they can get things done once more, then taking this checklist as a starting point would we think be a big help. So thank you. That's all for now. But I'll pass back to Jim.
Thank you very much, Jamie. I'll let you sit down again as a special treat. So, and I shall remove 2 C's by sitting here. So, what you have here, folks, are in a sense 2 separate things. There is a diagnosis of an issue and an assertion that the issue is a problem. The diagnosis of the issue is that there is an unacceptably wide gap between our political aims and political rhetoric and the implementation on the ground of the things that ministers say they're trying to do. Now, of course, there's always a gap between politics and reality, or let's call reality implementation for the moment. There's always a space between the two. There's a famous American quote that says that you campaign in poetry and you govern in prose. Well, I'm not convinced there's been very much poetry in some of this, but the prose simply doesn't hang together. The gap has got too large, and that's the diagnosis that this report offers. And it suggests some of the underlying causes. And there's an underlying cause, if you want to summarise it, it's that our politics now gives our politicians the wrong set of incentives. If you get elected or not by your stance on identity and the Constitution, then the incentives you have to worry about actually getting stuff done are actually quite small, because you get voted in anyway. And that certainly applies to 2 of our political parties, I'm afraid, because each of them it has been harnessing identity. And it's why the poor souls in the middle have been squeezed for some time. So that's a diagnosis. One of the really striking things in this that Jamie mentioned, I quite like just to repeat, because it kind of takes your breath away. Those of you who have a physical copy of the report in front of you, turn please to Appendix 1.
Sorry, it's on the online report. Sorry.
It's only in the online report, I beg your pardon. Appendix 1 is not available and is secret online. However, turn instead to page 20. And Page 20 records the thing that Jamie mentioned. There is one area of work in which the Scottish Government's productivity has improved hugely, and that is the churning out of strategy documents. It's quite extraordinary. One document a week on average. This year we're averaging 1.4 strategies a week. That's on top of the number of consultations per week, which is a similar number, right? We have more strategies and consultations than we have ever had before. That tells you two things. One, if you're writing a strategy, you're not implementing it. If you're consulting on a strategy, you're not implementing it. And if you're redoing the strategy, because there aren't enough topics to have a strategy, a fresh strategy and everything, there's a lot of repetition here. There are how many economic strategies, was it?
Over 100. Yeah.
Over 100 economic strategies. Something like 60 health ones, was it? I forget the numbers. That tells you something very, very significant about what government does. It says things, doesn't actually do them, is the message of this report. And I think we all kind of knew there was a lot of churning out of material, but these numbers are, frankly, extraordinary. However, there's also a set of propositions in here about what we should do about this, recognising some of the realities here, and we're really interested in views in discussion for whether the diagnosis is right and whether the concrete suggestions for change will actually do the job. I'm going to begin by asking Philip for his reaction.
Thanks, Jim, and nice to see so many well-kept faces in the audience. I'm slightly nervous, actually. There's a lot of folk here who I used to look up to with a bit of awe in the old Scottish office days. It's been a long time, but nice to see you all. Partly because of that, I have to give a bit of a declaration of interest in all this, because when I was reading this report, remembering my time setting the whole Curriculum for Excellence process off, all those years ago, and what's happened to that. I'm also, in the current day, I am a director of the Promise Scotland, which is the arm's length body. There's the Oversight Board and Promise Scotland, which has been set up arm's length from government, but paid for by government, in an attempt to drive forward the promise and all that comes with it. And on both of those subjects, I think if we want to open up those in discussion later, I'm not going to go into a lot of detail now, but very interesting as to how do you procure change in those very complex areas of social policy. I was also, and this is sort of with another hat on, at the very early thinking about the Queensferry crossing, when I was looking after, succeeded Eddie in the Department for Transport and lots of other things, as an example of we're getting infrastructure projects right. And with another hat on again, when I was down in the business department in the south, we set off the process that resulted in the Catapult Institutes, part of which is instrumental in the National Manufacturing Institute, which is actually another good example of long-term policy making. The whole basis of the Catapult Institutes was to try and create the long-term capability to translate stuff coming out of universities into productive economic activity in the UK, mimicking what was going on in Germany and elsewhere. So seeing this from different perspectives and good policy implementation is not impossible. So I do, in terms of the thrust of this report, it is absolutely been worth doing, and it is absolutely worth having a conversation about it. And I agree with many, not all, but many of the conclusions of how you get a change around all this. And coming at it, I did want to just do a little comparison with the sort of some thought about the broader context in which this is functioning. Now, like many in the room, I was knocking around as we went over the devolution horizon with all the promises back in 97, 99. Subsequent to that, when I went south, had oversight of 2 Scotland Acts, 2 Wales Acts, so pushing forward the devolution agenda. Since leaving government, been quite involved in thinking about devolution in England. In other words, I've got quite a stake in devolution working. And when you look at some of the stats and some of the evidence that this report assembles, but some of the stats about comparative performance, it's a bit awkward, because the critics of devolution say, well, okay, you've had 20 years Scotland, Wales, Northern Ireland, what have you got to show for it? So this sort of touches a bit of a raw nerve. It has to be said, however, that it's not as though the UK government covers itself with glory around us. And Jim did ask me to sort of reflect. I was in Whitehall for close on 10 years. And just to give you a couple of totemic examples of Whitehall screwing up mightily on implementation. Jamie's already mentioned HS2. We can talk about HS2, but what a shambles. How to get everything wrong on a major infrastructure project. We ought to be building that railway, not just from London to Birmingham, but to Manchester, Leeds, and indeed further north. Other countries manage this stuff, far less cost, far less hassle. Just extraordinary how badly wrong we've got that. But just to give you a couple of other examples, social care. How many reports, reviews have there been in the South about fixing social care? Has it been fixed? Absolutely not. And one that is probably the most distressing is regional policy for England. And if you go through the history of regional policy, the chops and change over time, and the net outcome of all of that investment, all of that policy, is the gap between London, the South East, the rest of England, has grown wider over time. In other words, that whole panoply of policy effectively has been a failure. And that for all sorts of reasons, but you can see that the South, in terms of actually implementing policies that won't make a difference, has had its own problems. You know, quite often in Scotland you hear, well, it may be bad up here, but at least it's not as bad as it is down there, which is a very lame excuse, not least because there are some very significant advantages that Scotland has, particularly across the domain of devolved policy. There is self-evidently the extra public expenditure in Scotland. We should be getting a better return for the investment that, in brackets, the English taxpayer makes in higher public expenditure in Scotland, and we're not seeing that. You also have the advantage of scale. If you look across the world, many of the most advanced polities in terms of public policy making a big difference are small. And there's a reason for that. So you think Singapore, New Zealand, Finland, and so on. So it is because you have that scale effect. It is easier, or ought to be easier, to get the right folk around the table to fix these particularly complex social policy problems. And indeed in Scotland we have the advantage of the National Performance Framework, which the SNP government introduced in 2007. Again, I had a hand in developing that, which gives you that framework to think systemically about how you deal with public policy. And we've had that's been in the public consciousness in Scotland now for over a decade, but has again not delivered on the promise that it held. So why haven't things been done better? I think just one, again, reflection looking north and south, it's the way that politics up here has demonstrated some of the same pathologies as the South. This was with the promise of devolution, a system ironically designed to institutionalise essentially coalition government. Coalition government, which I've worked in Scotland, but also in the South, and you look across the continent to see how coalition governments work. In many ways, it makes it easier to get into that longer term thinking, because you have to build consensus across different parties, and you have literally in the room, you've always got at least two voices around every decision, so you don't get that sort of focus on that very narrow focus that essentially one-party politics brings. But instead of that, we've had this deeply partisan politics essentially since 2007, much as we've had in the South over recent years. And that, I think, as a consequence, politics that is resolutely short-term. We'll talk a good game on the long-term stuff like climate change and so on, but without willing the means to those ends and ducking the issues that might help us to achieve those ends. Just one recent example, I mean, head in hand really, but the Humza Yousaf announcing the other week, party conference, the freezing again of council tax, and you look at local authorities across Scotland absolutely on their knees. We experience this every day. I mean, the potholes in Dumfriesshire, as I've experienced, are some not even with local government. For a very short-term political end, I think it's just one example, very absolutely extraordinary. But also the way in which Scotland has sort of inherited the Whitehall default of centralising stuff. So if it moves, and we think it's important, try and haul it in. So that centralising instinct, which I think we'd hope that devolution would be away from that, but clearly haven't. Excuse me. Clearly all of this has been exacerbated by the constitutional debate, both north and south. Now, both Brexit and independence, it pains me to say so, perfectly political, perfectly legitimate political objectives. You can't argue against people wanting to advance both of those things, but the cost of that obsession on the constitutional has been to drive attention away from the workaday and often mundane world of policy implementation and improvement. And that central thesis of this report I absolutely agree with. So the challenge, it seems to me, and this is a tough challenge, and we can't run away from that, to all political parties, it's not just for the government of Scotland as it stands at the moment, to all political parties, is how do they advance their different political constitutional agendas at the same time as building cross-party consensus, which is necessary to improve public service over time. You cannot improve public service on a short-term turnaround where policy switches with every change of government. You have to build for the longer term. So just in asking that question, it shows, I think, how difficult that is. How do we get to that point? Well, a couple of thoughts on that. One, ultimately politicians will respond to public pressure, and this report, this meeting, in a very small way at this stage, by stimulating this sort of debate, hopefully you get some momentum in the media, in the political debate around this issue that puts the pressure on the political class to get this right. I mean, that is going to be a long haul, it seems to me. But there is another side of this, which is where wise politicians, and there are wise politicians around, can see how they can help themselves to get into this territory. And this is where I sort of slightly disagree with the title of the report, A Little Less Conversation. In some respects, I think we need more conversation, but the right sort of conversation. And that is conversation that takes the problem out into public space and makes it a public property in a way that you get a cross-party engagement with that, but you also get the citizens of the country thinking through how those solutions might be arrived at. So you build both the greater likelihood of consensus, but you then build pressure and a platform for implementation. So I am thinking about things like citizens' assemblies and so on. How otherwise do you deal with problems like finance for higher and further education, getting us away from the tuition fee debate into non-partisan space? How do you build a consensus around what sort of exam system should support school education? How do you get us into space where we have a long-term sustainable land use policy and so on and so forth? So maybe slightly controversially, just to sort of spark up the debate, I absolutely agree that this sort of constant consultation, round of consultation strategies becomes an activity in its own right, but turning that into something that is more productive of public debate, where politicians in a way can find themselves in a space where they are helping to develop a consensus, which then turns into implementation, might be part of the way forward.
Thank you very much, Phil. I'm sure that great analyst of public policy, Elvis Presley, would agree with you on that one. However, Lucy, there were a number of things there where I could see you thinking, I'm not sure about that. So do give us your review.
Well, I'm not going to start by agreeing with Phil. It's just like a daunting audience. I'm in this audience of 3 people who were instrumental in my professional development at various points. I'm going to talk about professional development of civil servants. So if you don't like what I've got to say, I can just point them out to you at the end. So much from what Philip was saying. I want to make a context point about all of this we haven't touched on yet, which is that the post-COVID world, we have governments in debt. We have Western economies whose long-term position financially, relative to other economies, is constantly, but increasingly, I think, in doubt. I think we have a population used to a level of public service delivery, even now, even with any problems, which is coming quite sharply out of kilter with what we can actually raise money to fund. And I look at this, I've got a teenage child, and I look ahead to the world facing her, and I think all this stuff we have to put against a context which is not static. It's really not static. I'm really quite worried, I'm actually quite deeply worried about the legacy of expectation in the population versus what we're going to have the funding to cover. And I think that's a massive part of what, if I was trying to engage a politician, I'd say it's all going to hit the buffers. It's hitting the buffers. The reason you have potholes, the reason my daughter is using a 1950s textbook still, the reason that we have one average amount of absence from school now in very high post-COVID, and we haven't got a service to catch those young people. And that's all going to come through in the next 10, 20 years. We've got a very, very distressed young population who've come through a horrendous experience at formative points of their life. We've got an ageing population, so not to cheer you up or anything, but I have to say all that because that's what we mean when we talk about policy making. That's what we mean. We don't just mean keeping the ship of state happily buzzing off down the canal. That we should be so lucky. So another thing I wanted to pick up from Philip was about devolution and comparisons, and I did a PhD which I finished recently, which was a comparison of student funding in Wales and Scotland, which I need to do more with. But one of the two things to say about that, David Rafe, the late much missed David Rafe at Edinburgh, talked about home nation comparisons between different bits of the UK, and we should do way more of that. The good and the bad, we learn. And what we learned from Wales, they did do cross-party. They came up with quite a decent patch. And they did it because they had constraint. And actually what forced it to work was constraints and edges. Not having a completely blank canvas. It's easier sometimes when you've got constraints to come to some kind of agreement between people. So yeah, I was really interested to report. I agree with a lot of it. Like Philip, I disagree with some. Like Philip, I'm going to disagree with the title, but I'm going to disagree with a different bit, just because, and it's good to disagree because the one bit everyone will have read is the title, so we can start there. I'm going to disagree with the focus on an implementation gap, and I'm going to disagree with one of your recommendations at the end. And the reason I'm going to disagree is because I think we have a policy-making gap. I don't think we have an implementation. We do have implementation gaps, but what we have is very precisely a policy-making gap. I'm a gamekeeper turned poacher, so I've spent the last 10 years outside the civil service looking in, often arguing, sometimes just as a kind of distant commentator, sometimes engaging with civil servants, sometimes putting into many consultations. And so I'm putting in FOIs, which is one of the few ways you really get much sense as to where it's the politicians and where it's the civil servants. And watching people at committee and all the rest of it. And what I would say is the policy-making skills in the civil service in Scotland, and possibly the rest of the UK, I'm not making this as a Scottish point, but just as the bit I watch of Scotland, are not what they should be. So I'm going to say what I mean by policy-making skills, I'll say why I think that, and I'll say something about how I think we fix it, because there's no point talking about it, and with Philip here, there is no point talking if we haven't got a plan. So, policy making, I would say, is the ideas bit of government. It's the bit where you test the string of words the minister gives you. I want to close the attainment gap. I want to make Scotland the best place to grow up. We're going to have a curriculum for excellence. It's those strings of words, the policy making process where you pick that apart and you spend time with your politicians asking them what they really mean, exploring what they really mean. And sometimes what they mean may be so off the wall and impossible, you have to bring them down to something they can present that they mean. And it's that process of ideas and thinking, it's bottoming out what the problem is you're really trying to solve. You're constrained, they're political, you live within their political barriers. That's important. This is not about civil servants seizing the democratic machinery, but it's about understanding and fixable problems, trying to find problems that are actually fixable, because a huge part of government problems, policy making in Scotland, I think, looks at closing the attainment gap in schools. 30 seconds should have told you that's just a ridiculous gap. Okay? No one in any country ever does that. If you understand why we have attainment gaps, you know you can't close them. You can narrow them, but you can't close them. Because that's a much bigger problem. But these kind of things. So I think that part of the machine is not functioning well. It's about what. It's also about how. And the bit that I see most, because I'm engaged largely on things I disagree with the government on, is how to disagree. The Scottish government's got very bad at coping with criticism and disagreement and people who disagree with it. It's very bubbly. That may also be true in other parts of the world. So but it's very much in a bubble. And I can add anecdotes. I don't want to disappear down into anecdotes, but I do have a few, obviously, given my recent history. And they are really, really bad, to the point that one of the things I do, I have a colleague, I work with two other women, one of whom used to work in government comms, and one of our constant conversations is wishing we could just go in and tell them how to disagree with us better. We spend quite a lot of time going, why are they giving the press office that line? This would be a much better way of defending them. And we spend an a surprising amount of time tearing our hair out. They're not very good at disagreeing. And they're very, very bad at talking to critics, and they have frozen out. It's a very bubble culture in the Scottish government. And that distresses me. One of the skills that I think sort of underlying what Philip's career is negotiation skills. Good civil servants have good negotiation skills. I think negotiation skills are really missing in a lot of what we see happening out of government. There's a lot of telling, but there's not a lot of negotiating. So I worry about that as a lost skill. So I think, I was trying to think, where does it go wrong? Why have we lost these things? I think where I learnt to be able to do policy making, it's a thing you learn on the job. It's a very apprentice type thing. I'm going to look sideways at my colleagues. It's a thing, you learnt a lot by the people who you worked for who were good at it. The most I learnt about how to do things like how to analyse a problem, how to option appraise, how to work out who the interested groups were, how to engage with them without causing nuclear war. I learnt by watching Jim and Eddie and everyone, John as well, actually, all of you, and other bosses I had, very much doing it. Ken Mackay, those of you who ever knew Ken would know that he was an absolutely extraordinary manager of complex situations, and I learned a lot. And I learned, before I came into the civil service, I worked for a former civil servant who'd been very senior and come out and was working in another organisation. And I learned at their feet, at their knees. We don't do that anymore, I don't think. I think we have a culture where the senior staff look up all the time, and this is a politics point. Too many politicians doing too much servicing. I spoke to a very interesting young woman about 8 or 9 years ago. She was doing a master's at Edinburgh Public Policy. She'd done her thesis, went around talking to civil servants in Scotland about what they thought their job was. Really interesting. She said she spoke to people at the people who'd been a long time and were more senior were very eloquent on what it meant to be a civil servant. Very eloquent. And then she went and talked to people at what were the kind of lower grades that were down in the branch structure, and the newer recruits. They had no idea. They didn't know what the job involved. They were confused. And I see really poor quality stuff emerging from government that I wouldn't have let out the door when I was a branch head. Routinely, really routinely. And I think what would be is people are undermanaged on basic skills. Not implementation skills, but policy making skills, administrative skills, negotiating skills. I think we have a really big problem, and that may also be true in Whitehall, I don't know. So that group, I think the critical grade, I'm going to come on to a thing, and then a bit more empirical data to add to the report. The critical grade at which I think you learn to be a good policy maker in the civil service is a branch head. I think that's the most important role in the civil service. They're the engine room. They're the engine room. If you've got bad branch heads, you will get bad policy. It's very, very hard to make good policy as a person in that role that's not good at policy making. And those people learn to be good because the people above them teach them. And this may seem like a very kind of narrow focus, but I think it really matters because sometimes you have to look under the bonnet, and that's what I see when I look under the bonnet, people who are underguided and under-supported coming into the profession. And it is a profession. So I had a look, I thought I'd have a look at who's running the civil service by professional background in Scotland at the moment. And there are 9 people at the top who are the Permanent Secretary and his 8 Director Generals. 3 of them have what I'd call conventional policy backgrounds. One of them has come right the way through, I think. I haven't checked his biog, I've known him in the system so long, I've seen he's come all the way through. 2 people came in, one from the diplomatic service and one from outside government, to be a branch head level person and then got promoted internally. Those are people who have come through the Scottish machine and they will have been sort of trained up and skilled. The other 5 people have different backgrounds, and that's fine because not everything that the Scottish government does is policy making. But there are plenty of people at senior levels of the government who've been in the private sector, who've done big management jobs in the NHS or whatever. That's one thing. Then I looked at the next level down. There are about 50-odd directorates in the Scottish government. That's the old grade 3 for those of you who are into that kind of level. Very, very important level. There are 50. I could only find 3 people, 3 in those 50 who had a conventional policy-making career that I recognised. 3. There were a lot more who'd been in government a while. There's a lot of direct entrants at deputy director level. I think it's quite hard, it's surprisingly hard actually to pull out the biographies of our senior civil servants, and I think that's maybe not great. But that's where I'm going to have to argue with, we need to change who we recruit to bring in more external people. We bring in quite a few, actually. And what we don't do, if you come in at direct entry deputy director, you are probably, no one ever tells you how to make policy. I think you're just dropped in. You'll be dropped in with some horrendous amount of stuff on your plate and left to deal with it. And your boss is very busy. So I worry that we are bringing in lots of people. We have a system which used to presume that you learn how to make policy by the way I learned it. But those people are actually not in the system very much anymore. We need to discover how we tell people how to make policy again. And I think the reason we have this problem is partly to do, goes back to 97, there was a big war, a kind of a diagnosis back 30 years ago, and it was fair enough that people were worried about people sitting in offices who didn't know how things worked, making policy and sending it out and not having any implementation skills. But I think it's a sort of baby in bathwater issue where we have lost, we took for granted the thing we did easily. I came out of the house and my husband had the radio on, and it was Joni Mitchell, it was Big Yellow Taxi. You know, you don't know what you've got till it's gone. I suggest what we've got, what's going, is that policy-making thing, and that we need really to find a way to bring back and value. I came out of the civil service, people think I have magic skills. I go and deal with people out in the world, and I do what I was trained to do, and for me it seems very easy. I analyse things, I take them apart, I ask questions. What does that mean? Was your evidence? Why? And they think I've got some kind of magic skill. In the civil service, we just took that for granted in people. No one ever made me feel I had a magic skill when I was doing it in the civil service, because it was just the bread and butter. But I think we're losing sight. So that's my argument. My argument is we may have an implementation gap, but we have a policy-making gap.
Thank you very much, Lucy. So some interesting reflections there. One is that, for Philip, that strikes me as the comparative one, and it's easy to see the mess in your own doorstep, but maybe the neighbour's doorstep isn't very clean either. But I think there is a real challenge, nevertheless, for Scotland here, because if we're telling ourselves that devolution can be made to work, and we're telling other people to do it, we really need to be able to demonstrate that it does work. And of course, Lucy is absolutely right that there are 2 ways of closing a gap. One is to get your implementation skills better, one is to get your policy making better. If you insist on promising the impossible, then you will not deliver it. Nevertheless, you have to do both of them. And there's clearly, I think, strong evidence here of an incapacity to implement, as well as some fairly ropey policy making processes, and the 2 do go together. The comparators, go back to the comparators, it's really interesting. If you sit in Edinburgh, you look down the railway line to London. It would be really much better if there were a better railway line to Cardiff, as I found trying to get there next week. It takes you 7 hours, and we should watch the Welsh rather more. In this room, some months back, we had a conversation about taxation, in which the Welsh should be much more thoughtful than we are, actually, much more thoughtful. And they're not, and to go back to the comparison here, they are not so obsessed by the constitutional question. There's a constitutional issue around in Wales, and that's just fine, but it doesn't dominate their politics, and nor do they have the same kind of dominating, centralising government, because they can't manage it. It's not up to them. They don't want to have it. So maybe maybe we should have a little more a bit more humility. We can go on this. And they don't have very many ministers. They can't afford it, the poor resource. So an interesting set of thoughts, but no doubt, at least I hope, that this will have stimulated thoughts in your minds around the table, around the room. So I'm really looking forward to what people's reactions are.